Okay, good evening, everybody. Once again, welcome to another episode of Mondays with Moshe. Thank you all for joining. Looks like we're getting a little sluggish late start tonight. I wonder why, but I have some suspicions. I want to welcome tonight all of you new faces and new names that I see on the screen. And I'll give you a couple of minutes at the end of the show for those of you who want to introduce yourself and say hi. I'd love to meet you in person. For those who could turn on your videos, it's always nice to see you in person. And especially if you raise your hand and ask a question, it would be really nice if we could see you. For those of you who can't, we understand that you might not be able to. Tonight's guest is Dr. Leslie Korn. Hi, Leslie, and thank you very much for joining from way
Hi.
out in Mexico. So we've covered a good part of the world at this point. We're a year and a half into Mondays with Moshe, and it's really nice to have you. Tonight's topic is the process of nutrition and the effects that it has on mental health. And hopefully we'll learn some information that we can, we'll be able to spill over and share with our clients who are suffering with mental health conditions and may actually be able to be helped in more ways than us mental health professionals are aware of through other means of more simple intervention. So Dr. Korn, please introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, how you came into this field, and how you kind of gravitated or leaned towards the field of nutrition.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Great to be here. Well, I'm originally from Boston, and as you can tell, I decided that weather was not for me after I graduated college and hightailed it off to the tropics of Mexico. And really, having grown up in a conservative household in Boston, food was absolutely important, essential. Before I left Boston, I trained in yoga and meditation. I was very active in the Our Bodies, Ourselves movement, of the feminist movement. And when I went off to Mexico, I landed in a small fishing village, no cars, no roads, no electricity, and I was happy as could be. And it was there that I got absolutely sick with everything possible. With no doctor, no nurses, I had to rely on the local curanderas, the local healers who used herbs and foods and poultices, really like my great grandmother used to use in Romania, as it turns out. So I spent 20 years living in the jungle. Out of my work there, it evolved into a health center and an educational center. After the first 10 years, I decided to go back to the jungle of Boston and did my conventional training, first in health psychology, and then later in public health at Harvard, where I studied nutrition. And then I went over to the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, where I really brought some of these healing, what we think of as holistic healing methods into the Department of Psychiatry, where I trained in conventional psychodynamic psychotherapy, post-trauma therapy, and I've practiced as a psychotherapist ever since. So that's a little bit about what brought me to this work. And really, while my original training was in nutrition and herbal medicine, I really longed to get back to that after having had a very fulsome practice in Cambridge for many years. I decided to go back to the jungle, back to Mexico, and then to really reinitiate my passion for what we think of as indigenous or cultural, really the original cultural practices that kept our ancestors healthy. And really, they didn't have the exposure to all of the toxins and the poor quality foods and the refined foods that we did. And what I noticed working with people is among my patients, those who had a better quality diet, who gave up sugar, who gave up Coca-Cola, who made fresh food every day, who really practiced, again, as our ancestors did, didn't buy a lot of fast food, didn't drink too much coffee, didn't drink too much, did much better in the psychotherapeutic process. They healed faster, they got better faster, they took care of themselves better, they exercised. And I began to really see this as the missing link in mental health, that we could talk all we can, but we needed to address the needs of the body and the fuel of the body that was fueling the mind. And so that really catapulted me onto this whole approach of using nutrition for mental health.
Wow. That's a lot of places you were in terms of placing yourself with, in different programs and learning experiences. I mean, tell me a little bit about the mental health conditions. When you talk about nutrition or healthy eating or healthy diet, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics, but what about psychopathology? Are you talking about conditions such as neurotic conditions or psychotic conditions?
Everything,
Really, can you see?
absolutely everything. Now, that's not to say that poor nutrition causes psychopathology. Though we know, I'll tell you an interesting story how we discovered that gluten exacerbates depression and can even contribute to psychotic disorders. Back during World War II in Great Britain, there was a wheat shortage. And they found that a large percentage of people who were institutionalized in the asylum with psychotic disorder got better. And the research is incontrovertible on people who are sensitive to gluten, could be sensitive or could be allergic, meaning celiac, have a very high percentage of depression and neurological disorders. And almost 50% of people with psychotic disorder are sensitive to gluten. And when you take people off gluten, they get better. Does that cure psychotic disorder? Not necessarily. No, it's not the sole cause, but it can exacerbate it. And so we know that people who are sensitive to gluten can experience depression quite commonly. The research is there, along with psychotic disorder. Now, we see this also in autism spectrum as well. There are high percentages of sensitivity to these proteins, basically, both casein, the protein in cheese or dairy, along with the gluten or the gliadin. There's also a reaction to these glutens that's called a casomorphin or a gluteomorphin, which creates opiate-like peptides in the brain that make you, I don't know if you've ever OD'd on a lot of, gluten one day, and then the next day you kind of wake up a little drunk or a little kind of soporific. It's because these proteins can create really higher amounts of these opiate-like structures in the brain. So that's just one example of the effects of certain proteins in foods like grains or dairy.
So we have to stop. We have to start keeping our kids away from gluten because they can get high on it. Is that what you're saying? We have
Well,
to
I
keep the
mean,
gluten locked up in the cabinet.
you can test for it. So people who aren't sensitive, it won't bother. But if you're sensitive and they're coming out with greater, more highly sensitive tests all the time, it can really inform some of these decisions. And the
So,
other thing I just wanted to say is that there's no question that life experiences create psychopathology or even all of the, in my practice, I see a lot of depression, anxiety, panic disorder, insomnia, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex trauma. I think that's really much of what I see, some attention issues as well. And there's no question that life experiences, and particularly early life trauma, contributes to these disruptions. These early life traumas often co-occur with food insecurity or with fighting at the table. We know that digestion is a parasympathetic experience, meaning to digest food, we need to be relaxed. So it all is in a big bundle, this experience. And then over time, growing up, whether you're food insecure or not, or eating a lot of fast food, you get lots of disruption neuroendocrinologically, which really weaves together the life experience with the nutrition experience to create what we see in our offices.
Wow. Wow. That's fascinating. I just want to remind everybody, it's a little after 10 after 9. And I really encourage those of you who have questions. This may be above some of our pay grades, including myself, but some of you might actually be familiar with nutrition and health, and we'd really love input, be it questions or comments from anybody who's on this call. And actually, I'm going to make the exception. If there's anybody who's on this call who is not a clinical, doesn't have a clinical licensure in mental health, but does have familiarity with nutrition and diet and food, I'd love to hear any contributions or any questions, because this is really fascinating. And this is news. What Leslie, you were telling me before the call that there is building a body of research about on this. This isn't just your own fantasy that you're creating.
That's right. It's not a fantasy. Well, I'm a scientist and I respect research, and I want to understand. I think as psychotherapists, we often observe things in our offices that we then go find the science to back up, because that's our experience. We know what we're seeing and what we're working with, and often what works and what doesn't. So there is a body of research on nutrition and mental health. I think one of the most important things for our purposes, given that we see so much depression and anxiety, is that we now understand that depression is an inflammatory disorder. And one of the things that we do in nutrition is we reduce what are called pro-inflammatory foods. When you've got lots of inflammation in the body, it keeps your immune system on edge. Think about what happens when you stub your toe and it gets all big and red and inflamed, and all that fluid rushes to the area of hurt and attempts to soothe it. And over a number of days, it relaxes and you feel better again. However, with this kind of low inflammatory effect of these kind of chronic exposures to these crappy foods, it's called the SAD diet, the standard American diet, for a reason. We get this kind of low level fire. Think about just kind of banging on that stubbed toe every day a little bit, keeps it inflamed. And what that does is it creates this level of immune response that actually lowers neurotransmitter function in the brain. It lowers serotonin levels. And I'm not saying that the whole theory of depression rests on the serotonergic theory, because I don't think it does. But I think it's all, again, part of this whole, that we're biochemical beings, we're metabolic beings, we're emotional and spiritual beings as well. And all of this works together. So what I say is, let's now look at this piece that we don't often look at, and reduce those pro-inflammatory foods, which we know underlie depression. So what I do with clients is, the first thing is help them get off the sugar addiction. I think that's the number one culprit in so many areas of people's health.
So can you just go back for a second to the inflammatory, when you talk about depression being an inflammatory disease, which I've heard before, what exactly is it that's inflaming, that's being inflamed by, I'm assuming, unhealthy foods and other things?
Yeah, there are a whole series of foods, mainly these refined foods, mainly your white sugars and your white flours, that spike glucose and that inflame and excite the immune system to always be on, to always be, like I say, going and rushing to that stubbed toe all the time without giving it a rest. And so we know that this chronic fire, basically, that's at work in the body affects brain chemicals negatively. And so that's one way. It's not the only pathway, but it's one way it works.
Okay, let's take a question first, and then we'll continue the discussion. Shifi, go ahead.
I had a question and then I didn't have a question anymore. I was actually going to ask about sugar in the diet. So I guess I would love to hear more about that. Obviously, we talk about children, sugar, hyperactivity. I'm curious how it shows up in the adult diet, what kind of effects it has in the adult diet. How is it different? How is nutrition in children different than in adults? Is it different, or is it kind of the same?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's kind of the same. It's just beginning earlier. And, some of us come into this world with a lot of constitutional strength, and we can endure a lot of assaults or insults. Think about the people you may know that live to 90 and they've been drinking and debauching their whole lives. And then we see these very vulnerable children who by 8 or 9 or 10 years old are really struggling. They're struggling with their gut function, for example. And I think a lot is found there. Dr. Gershon out of New York is the one who named it the second brain, because it's such an important, really defining force in our mental health and in our gut function in general. So I find in my practice that people are really struggling with an addiction to sugar. And I think if we go back to these general principles of what did our ancestors eat and how did they stay healthy, they did not eat sugar. They didn't have sugar. There was no diabetes type 2. There weren't any number of chronic illnesses that come out of the fact that in our modern lives, we tend to extract something from the whole. You don't get diabetes by chewing on a sugar cane. You don't get addicted to cocaine by chewing on a coca leaf in the mountains of Peru. You get addicted because that active substance gets extracted, and that's where you get your punch. And that's where you get your punch for the sugar. And that's really a lot of how pharmaceuticals are made. A lot of herbs were found in the jungle, and they've extracted the essence of that herb to get you that response. But with it comes these side effects because nature gave us the whole plant. Nature gave us sugarcane because sugarcane has B vitamins, it has magnesium, it has fiber. So when you mix your sugar in the cane with all of those ingredients, including water, the uptake in your body is more. B vitamins and magnesium are anti-inflammatory. So you don't get sick from what nature by and large has given us. So I think we have this general principle to follow about what are we extracting and potentizing? What are we making so powerful as a food drug? Or, Dr. Lustig calls it a poison, and I agree with him. It's not even a food. So what we know is we get addicted to it like we might any kind of drug. And as you point out, it alters mood. I have a saying that mood follows food. If your blood sugar drops, you get moody and irritable. Just think about those days when you skip lunch or you miss lunch because you've been working or you don't have your snack with you and you want to throw your book against the wall because you've just lost it, or you might get shaky. That's your blood sugar dropping. And we need glucose for the brain. We need that to keep functioning. But the refined sugar boosts it so rapidly and so radically, it's like a drug. So it boosts us up, it makes us, wow, happy and on top of the world for about an hour, and then it sinks us lower than we can believe. And so the idea is that just like we do in psychotherapy, we're looking for balance, we're looking for self-regulation, we're looking for that smoothing out those highs and lows, whether it's emotional or food-based.
That's fascinating. Is there a hereditary component to this? So you touched on the fact that some people
Yeah.
are glucose, gluten intolerant, have celiac. How much of that is hereditary?
Well, celiac is a hereditary genetic-based disease. And then there are many, many people who have variations on gluten sensitivity, and you can test for that. I'm so glad you asked that question because that links it to culture and our ethnicity, our backgrounds. Whoever we are today, wherever we live, we carry the genetic code of our ancestors. And just think about people who live in the Arctic. What kinds of foods do they eat? They didn't have any sugar cane. They live on fat, mostly fat, some protein, and very few carbs. They didn't have any bread. They didn't have any rice. They didn't have any sugar, certainly. So those people, generally people of the northern climes, do much better on what we here call the keto diet. That's more fat, and some protein and low carbs. They've got some berries that pop up in the summer or some root vegetables, but that's it. Then you go, let's say, like where my people are from in Eastern Europe, we're looking at lots of carbs, lots of protein, moderate amount of fat, not a huge amount of fat, but lots of protein, because my people were tilling the fields. They were pushing, they were doing heavy labor all the time. And they needed those beets and those carrots and those onions and all of those sulfur-rich foods to detoxify as well. Then you look at some people of the southern climes, those are very much more the vegetarian style diets in the warm weather, in the heat. And so when you ask, is this genetically based? It absolutely is. And what we see in mental health is, if you are living life as a vegetarian, but you're actually a biological carnivore, you're very much more likely to be very anxious and panicky. Likewise, if you're eating lots of meat and not getting enough vegetables, and you really should be a little bit more on that spectrum, then you're going to have your own set of problems as well. You could also be anxious and depressed. So I think part of all this that I link, which not a lot of people do, is that there's no one right diet for everyone. It's all about where you come from and what your ancestors thrived on.
That is
So,
fascinating.
so are you suggesting that everybody has to sort of follow what their ancestors lived on? So if somebody, like you're saying, from Eastern Europe should not be eating a high fat keto diet because that won't work for them?
Not what I'm saying exactly, because where I begin with clients is that I ask them to pay attention to how they feel. If you feel great in your life and your diet feels great and your digestion feels great, then great, you're doing the right thing for you. But if you don't feel great, then something's off. It's not just the external factors, the external stressors, or the stressors that we grow up with. The fuel that we're feeding our car, just think about your different cars. Some of us drive Volkswagens, and Volkswagens will drive on anything. Some of us drive Jaguars. You need a very refined food for that. Some of us drive diesel engines. That needs a certain kind of diesel gas. Without that gas, you'll go kaput. So where I begin with clients is pay attention. I use what's called a food mood diary. Write down what you're eating. Are you drinking enough water? Not having enough water can make you depressed and have headaches. And then you're gulping down NSAIDs, and then you're tearing up your gut and your liver. And then you wonder why you're having all these problems. We just medicate our problems rather than identify the source.
So
And
how does anybody live without a nutritionist by their side?
well, this is what I'm saying to you, that I've written books on this, and I teach this to psychotherapists because I found this with myself, my family, my clients, my students. I've trained over 25,000 psychotherapists in doing this.
Wow.
Because we know that our clients come in drinking Diet Pepsi, which is almost worse than Pepsi with sugar itself. So I think it's about becoming aware. That's the first step. And then it's about really cataloging what we know are some of the major culprits and trying to detox from them. We know that drinking, 6 beers a night is not healthy. We know alcoholism is a sugar disease. It's a disease of sugar addiction. So this kind of information is similar to when we began our training as psychotherapists. There's a lot to learn, but we know the basics: being present, listening, unconditional response of admiration and acceptance. So we can have the basics and begin step by step, deepening our savvy of the knowledge.
Okay, well, I have a lot of personal questions on this, but I want to move on. Let's take a question from Mindy. Go ahead, Mindy.
Okay, hi, thank you. You've touched on the question I was going to ask right at the end of this, but as a psychotherapist, how do you see, you said you train a lot of psychotherapists. I'm having trouble putting this role into my current role. Like, I meet a client and going through their life and trying to decide what kind of intervention to use with them. And I don't see myself as an expert on food and how to use that. How do you integrate that into the work?
I think the first place to integrate it is with yourself. I think just as we went through some kind of psychotherapy to become psychotherapists, I think this work has to be very personal. We have to do it ourselves. We have to prove it to ourselves. We have to work with ourselves. It's no different than suggesting a depressed client go out and take a walk or even do some aerobic exercise. You don't need to be a nutritional therapist to recognize when you're sitting with a client, maybe they're drinking 6 or 8 cups of coffee a day and they're telling you they're anxious and they're having trouble sleeping. That's what I call psychoeducation. Did you realize that coffee is going to make you feel this way? Can we talk about what it would take to reduce the coffee? And then that might lead to all kinds of conversation. I'm fatigued, I'm stressed out, I haven't had any energy. By the way, I have chronic fatigue, I've got fibromyalgia, on it goes. Now, this may feel outside of your scope, but then you're in a position to collaborate and make a referral and build your knowledge base that way. So I always begin with ourselves. We're our own laboratories. And as we learn for ourselves, we can apply it with our clients. And then, of course, well, at the end, I'll share with you about my training programs as well, if you're interested.
Okay.
Thank you.
I want to ask the basic elephant question in the room that I think so many people have, which is, I guess twofold. First of all, people who struggle with depression have a very hard time controlling what they eat, or with anxiety. Food is a go-to drug to reduce these stressful and distressing feelings. That's question number one. And question number two, and this, again, I'm coming from my I guess my personal life and having tried diets that are the keto kind of diets or high fat diets, is that what happens if you always feel hungry? I mean, I've gone on high fat diets for a couple of years. It helped me lose weight, but besides all the side effects, the digestive side effects that it had on me, I also always felt hungry. I always felt like I was passing out.
Yeah, wasn't the right diet for you. Yeah. Well, let's look at again this idea that we need to find what the right fuel mix is for us, what satisfies us. What I teach about is certainly about healthy comfort foods and the principle of substitutions. It doesn't mean you can't have sweetness in your life. There's lots of natural sweeteners that are much better for you than refined sugar. I have a recipe in one of my books, and I teach groups of people how to make chocolate almond joys. What better food is there than chocolate, almonds, and coconut? Absolutely the best foods in the world. But we don't use white sugar to sweeten it. We might use a little honey, might add a little bit of stevia. So what we're doing is we're reducing the addiction to the really harmful foods. We're not depriving ourselves. I had a client not long ago who was going to Wendy's every day and getting French fries, and she had rosacea and she was depressed and anxious. She wasn't sleeping. We were working on a lot of levels. And I said, well, how about if you make those fries at home, but you bake those potatoes, and let's find a really yummy sauce that you can make. And I gave her a recipe for a cilantro mayonnaise sauce as a dip, and then she made a sriracha dip. Healthier approaches to these foods that, as you rightly point out, are comfort foods. People do need to have a sense of, I can self-regulate with healthy food. I don't need to self-regulate with these nasty foods.
Infomercial on xylitol.
Okay.
Is
Some
that
people do
okay?
well with xylitol, yeah. But some people it'll give a lot of gas to. and it'll kill your dog if your dog gets into it. So some people, if you notice that you eat these products that have xylitol in them and you have a lot of gas, you're reacting to it. So it's going to be very individual for everyone about what is right for them. But we're not talking about self-abnegation here. No, we're
Right.
talking about enjoying delicious foods, but making sure they're fresh, without additives. I'm thinking about the question earlier about kids. We know there are chemicals in foods that they're putting into foods to enhance flavors that are called excitotoxins. They actually excite parts of the brain and really can make you anxious and exacerbate bipolar disorder, by the way. These, particularly these artificial sweeteners have been found through research, particularly to really destabilize mood.
Wow. All right, let's take a question from Frady, and then we have tons more questions. Frady, go ahead. Just unmute and go ahead.
Hi, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concepts of intuitive eating. So I'm just wondering like how this, if it can be combined together with that, because, like we know statistically, restricting doesn't only results in, gets worse if you restrict. So how do we, it's like, yes, it's beautiful to have healthier sugars and all that, but living in this world, we're surrounded by so much unhealthy sugars and unhealthy foods, and myself and people I know, it's very hard to stop that, and it ends up being like short-term positive changes that are hard to maintain in this society. And how does it not result in getting worse at the end?
Yeah, I think this works very nicely with intuitive eating, and I understand what you're saying, but I think that it's no different than what we're asking our clients to do in terms of making changes in their lives, in their relationships, in their work life. It's really about self-care, and it's about strengthening that self-care muscle and noticing the difference between how I feel and how my gallbladder feels when I eat at Wendy's or grab something, Big Mac, and how it feels when I've made a nice meal at home. How do I feel when I've made something with olive oil or coconut oil? Or how does it feel when I'm eating deep fried fat? Now, many people will do well up until they hit 40, and then the doctor says, we've got to take your gallbladder out. And so I think this is quite analogous to everything we're doing. It's not an overnight change. It has to be congruent with what we're ready to do and what changes we're ready to make. I think we can eat intuitively by developing our taste buds for more natural foods, because our taste buds have really been hijacked by the modern diet. We don't own our taste buds anymore when we're eating all of these processed foods, because the additives in them are put there specifically to really drug us and make us crave these things. So there is an element of detoxing. There's an element of detoxing from, let's say, not adding a lot of excess salt to your foods as well. If you've got hypertension, it's something you have to learn to do. And what I'm saying is we apply some of these principles to physical health and we accept them, but we're just on the verge. Well, certainly people I work with are full into it, but we're still, in terms of mainstream, on the verge of applying this all to mental health.
Well, question for you. Are there people who are lactose intolerant or gluten intolerant who can actually report feeling more anxious or depressed after eating one of those kinds of foods?
Good question. Most of the world is lactose intolerant, but and it will contribute to digestive upset, but it's not the lactose, which is the sugar part of milk. that really bothers people, or the sugary part of dairy. It's the protein part, the casein, that really contributes to mental distress. So I'd separate the lactose intolerant from the casein intolerant. That said, most of the world, unless you're really born and from Scandinavia, most of the world is intolerant to lactose. That's why you're better off, and this speaks to your question about comfort food. I always encourage my clients to use a full fat cream, an organic full fat cream in their coffee, instead of a creamer, which is just chemicals, or even low fat milk, which is pure lactose. So there again is the principle of what is it that's going to be best for your body.
Okay, because interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you something else to think about, and think about this with your clients. I guarantee you every one of your clients has a digestive problem. You do not see mental distress without digestive distress. Could be anywhere. It could be GERD, which we know is very highly correlated with chronic stress, PTSD, very high rates of GERD in the first responders to the 9/11 attacks, for example. But it could be further down. It could be fatty liver disease, which we're seeing earlier and earlier. Could be an ulcer, could be gastritis, could be gas, just lots of gas, could be intestinal colitis, inflammatory bowel. It could be constipation, diarrhea, anywhere along the line, that big tube of digestion from the mouth to the rectum and then the anus where it's all released. There's some problem, I guarantee you.
Wow.
You fix digestion, you help digestion, you help mental health.
So we got to get on this.
Absolutely.
I guess there's hope for all of us. Okay,
There is.
let's take a question from Melissa. Go ahead.
Hi. So it's not so much a question as a comment to someone else's question. I am actually a student of Dr. Korn's, and when someone forwarded me that she was presenting, I was very excited to join the call. It's good to see you. I definitely found a lot of value in the training, and I do use it in some ways in my practice most of the time. Someone asked about how you integrate it. What I would say with that is kind of keeping it in your own mind, like Dr. Korn said, and just kind of, it'll come out in your client's story sometimes, something that will like perk your ears up as to, oh wait, I wonder if that might be correlated to something that they're doing in their lifestyle that may be impacting it. But also I wanted to comment on the question about intuitive eating. I know that when I went to the training, I went with the specific purpose to learn more about this because it's a very it's very intriguing to me and part of how I believe that mental health should be treated. But I also think that it can be very overwhelming to someone who's just hearing about this and be like, oh my gosh, how do I make all these changes so quickly? Hearing that refined sugar is not so great for you, hearing about the concerns for people who are gluten intolerant. And I could say that many people, to answer your question, Moshe, about the intolerance leading to anxiety, I've definitely heard about that correlation. So I think there is something to that. Like if someone is gluten intolerant and they eat something that they're not supposed to, they may feel the the emotional symptoms as well as whatever physical symptoms they experience. But I think a part of it is making one small change at a time. Like you don't have to remove everything with sugar from your life or everything with gluten if you're not celiac, but just being aware of how it impacts you and making, using those tools of both intuitive eating and also just decision making of, if I know what the outcome of this particular behavior is, am I going to choose to do it anyways? Sometimes that's helpful. And I don't, it doesn't necessarily include a a full overhaul in the first day, but as you see it
Mhm.
being helpful, it's more motivating to continue to make those changes.
Those are great points. Great points.
Yeah, I think also we have so much in our repertoire that's behavioral too. The whole area of taking care of yourself, the whole area of just when we sit down to eat with our families and we relax first, we might pray, we might say grace, whatever it is that we do really comes out of this idea that it's now time to relax, let those digestive juices flow, and let the stresses of the day disappear. And whatever it is that you teach your clients about doing that is in itself just behavioral, regardless of what someone's going to eat, that you chew your food and that you break it down and that you prepare it for digestion rather than gulping it under stress. So I think there's a lot we can work with people around self-care and self-awareness. So thank you. Thank you. Is it Melissa, did you say?
It's Alyssa. I'm sorry, I
Alyssa.
muted her.
Okay,
Let's
great.
take a question from Esther and then we're going to move on.
I'm noticing some of your approach is so wholesome and it's so beautiful. And what I don't hear you mention is intermittent fasting, non-GMOs, the kombuchas and all that kind of stuff. And the health food eating that's promoted today is so expensive. Like someone who didn't come in with a monetary problem will walk out with one if they live in Whole Foods. And I think the idea of being attuned to how your body responds is so important. I personally, I can eat all the stuff we shouldn't eat and be okay. And found out that I personally have problems with red plums, eggplant, and garlic. And like they're really like you just have to be really tuned in. And it's a lot to ask of people that are trying to figure everything out.
It is, but you know, the other thing is, it's like you can make sauerkraut with a head of cabbage if you want. You can spend $1 on that cabbage and you can grate some carrot into it and you can have sauerkraut for a month. You don't need to go buy expensive probiotics at Whole Foods. You get some of the best vegetables for us. Beets. Beets are one of the healthiest foods for us. We can bake them, we can steam them, we can grate them and have them raw. Not an expensive vegetable. Or potatoes or garlic and onions, even bones, making bone broth, or using the cheapest cut of meats if you're going to eat meat, getting whole chickens and making soups or I encourage people to get lots of eggs. Eggs are one of the best foods there is. And you can boil up the eggs and have 1 or 2 a day, or sweet potatoes. You asked Moshe before, what are some of the best foods? These are among the best foods for us. And who can afford fresh salmon? But we can get wild salmon in a can for pretty cost-effective amount of money. So much of what I'm interested in, Esther, and I love that name, is that I want to have this available to everyone so that you don't have to have a lot of money and spend a lot of money, but that we think really carefully about what we're choosing and what we're eating and how we're preparing. I love the use of crock pots, for example, and making stews and roasts and things that will really last and persist and nourish. Because when Moshe, you said, on that diet, you were always hungry, that lets you know that's not the right fuel for you. That you need to be eating probably a keto diet's probably just not right for you. And you needed more carbs to really stick to your ribs to feel satisfied.
I kind of at the point where I forgot that I actually have ribs, but that's a different problem. We'll get back, we'll find them one day. One of my favorite lines from Abbott and Costello is where Costello says that he's very proud of himself. He's 120 pounds overweight and he's starting a diet now to get back to his regular weight. So Abbott asked him, well, what's your regular weight? He said 60 pounds overweight.
So this is, I love the idea of intuitive eating. And you asked Esther about intermittent fasting. I would say that that's a more advanced level, intermittent fasting. Kombucha, you know, if I'm working with a gentleman, I had a client the other day, his wife dragged him in, and he didn't want to be there. He loves his hot dogs and his sauerkraut. And I said, and he said, don't make me give that up. I said, I'm not. How about a better quality hot dog? How about fresh sauerkraut so you get some benefits? Let's just improve the quality of what you're eating as a first step. And so I think we really meet our clients wherever they are and can help them not be afraid of what's in front of them, which is making some changes for themselves and for their benefit.
So, okay, let's move on to the next question. Let's talk a little bit about detoxing. Suppose somebody wants to try lifestyle. These are lifestyle changes, essentially. I want to try a lifestyle change. I want to start, go off sugar. I want to go off gluten if that's what's necessary. White flour, and I want to start that lifestyle change. How long will it take for me to detox, to start recognizing that I'm feeling better, that some change is happening, which foods I'll become sensitive to because I'm off the main, the big ones. Tell me a little bit about that if I want to start tomorrow.
Okay, everyone is different. Every food has a different half-life, shall we call it, just like a drug. So sugar, you can be off of sugar physiologically in 7 days. You remember the old Atkins diet? You go on the Atkins diet, you do as much protein, as much fat, and a salad a day. And I promise you, after 7 days, probably after 4 days, after 7 days though, you will not crave sugar and your mood will be much more stable. And
And be
so
less
that's,
tired. And one thing I noticed when I went on the high fat diet was that I was much less tired. That was
yeah.
like the significant.
Yeah, and that's another thing to know about carbs and starchy carbs, not fruit and vegetables per se, but the starchy carbs. Those are best eaten later in the day because, as you point out, they do tire us. They increase our insulin response, which is why big sandwich at lunch makes us want to go to sleep an hour later. So part of this is also about front loading our protein and our vegetables and fruits in the morning, and then really focusing using our oatmeal at night. Usually we do it in the morning, but it's really an anxiolytic food, oatmeal. It's supposed to put us to sleep. So use it at night to relax. So there's that principle of what we eat at what time of day. But detoxing, so sugar, you can be off of sugar in 7 days if you want. And you do that in the way that I mentioned. Now, gluten is something a little different. Gluten, because if you're sensitive to gluten and you want to test it and you don't want to pay $400 or $500 to have the actual test for your sensitivity, you can do a 3-month gluten detox, because one of the effects of gluten is it tears up your intestines. And think of a sponge when it's new. A nice, beautiful sponge. That's what your intestines should look like. Now, think of that sponge after you've used it for 3 or 4 or 5 months. Its corners are off. It's got some big holes in it. It's kind of ratty looking. That's what intestines look like if you're sensitive to gluten. And so it takes time to restore and rebuild that nice new sponge of your intestines. So you need about 3 months with gluten. But even after a few weeks, it's not just mood and depression that's affected by gluten. You can get a lot of joint pain. You can think that you've got osteoarthritis when you're really sensitive to gluten. And so every type of food takes a different period of time to do a true detox, to really discover, do I feel better as a result of this? The other thing, I think it was Esther who mentioned eggplant. Many people are sensitive to the nightshade foods. Eggplant, tomatoes, there's so many of our favorite foods, chilies, potatoes. Many people have what feels like osteoarthritis in response to those foods. And you can go off those foods for 2 weeks. And if your joints feel better, then you may be sensitive to those foods and you need to titrate them a little bit. Just like you said, Moshe, when you said, oh, every once in a while I test out whether I can use this, milk or not. And it gets me every time. If you're sensitive to some foods, sometimes you can tolerate a little bit of it as long as you don't have too much of it. But for you, Moshe, I would look into ghee. I would use a little ghee. I'd use a little almond milk and ghee in your coffee and get a frother and froth it up. And I bet you'd enjoy that. And you'd get the benefits of what feels like the milk does for you, but without the side
Actually, I'm
effects.
actually drinking decaf. Well, my next project was decaf only, which I started a couple of months ago. And that also has helped me in its own ways, but
It
differently.
absolutely does.
Yeah.
That caffeine, I like to say coffee is a drug. It's not a beverage. So use it like a drug, use it wisely. Use it when you need energy, use it when you want more cognitive function, but don't overdo it. It'll do you in.
Okay. Question. Are there any, you were speaking about magnesium and other vitamins earlier. Are there any vitamin, intakes that you recommend we all, besides vitamin D, which I think 150% of people are deficient in or something like that, I think the studies show, right?
Yeah.
Are there any vitamins that are important that we should know about that we should be taking in regularly?
Well, let's focus first on vitamin D. That's the first thing I look at with clients. Everybody should have a vitamin D test. That'd be a perfect place to begin with your clients who are depressed, is make sure they're getting a serum, a blood test of vitamin D levels. And the problem with the lab tests is that they think too low level is good enough level. Research shows, as you point out, you really need a level at about 60 or 70, the number of your vitamin D, to really be anti-depression, anti-pain, and to support your immune health. So every client who comes in my practice, I ask for a variety of tests that they've had because I want to analyze them. But even at a very basic level, you can say, oh, have you had your vitamin D tested? And if they haven't, say, well, the next time you get a blood test, or why don't you talk to your primary care and let's get a test, because we know that vitamin D levels being too low can contribute to depression. So let's rule that out. And that's a very easy way to begin that. Now, after vitamin D, I think most people are going to benefit from omega-3 fatty acids. Now, current research is suggesting that getting it through fish is probably a little bit more effective than supplementation. Some clients will do both depending upon if they like fish or have access to it. So I think that's something that you can do. And we have tests for that as well. We've got finger prick blood tests that you can identify if you're deficient in essential fatty acids, if you've been exposed to too many trans fats. So we can work with that as well. I think other than that, I think in general, most people will do well with B vitamins. B vitamins are very soothing. They're very relaxing. They really target what are called really the neurological system. But when I say that, you then get into lots of detail about who genetically can really absorb these B vitamins. But in general, to answer your question, I consider the omega-3s, the vitamin D, the B vitamins, and then perhaps magnesium is the most important mineral that people are also deficient in.
Okay, so these are things, should we be taking supplements on these things if we're assumed to be deficient, or?
I think it's really, it's kind of like saying, should I be talking to my friend about, psychotherapy and getting psychotherapy with a friend? I think you can get a lot of support from talking to a friend about your problems, but is it professional support, like a psychotherapist? So I think it's about learning for yourself, discovering, exploring, and then knowing that line between what can I do for myself and where do I really want a professional to guide me and support me? Because after all, there's really crappy vitamins out there too, with
Right.
additives and sugars. Think about Metamucil. I had a patient today who said that she was constipated and taking Metamucil. I said, do you know that Metamucil is full of sugar and red dye? How about we get you some plain old psyllium, which is what Metamucil is. So very simple, not more expensive, but just a slight change to reduce that burden of exposure.
Yeah, but then she misses out on that orange taste like that. The delicious Metamucil orange soda, Fanta. All right, let's take a question from Devora. Go ahead, Devora.
Hi, Dr. Korn. I find this all so interesting because I really, believe in a lot of this, the stuff that you're talking about. So my question is, because I'm still trying to figure out integrating it into a practice, because it feels like two separate things almost, like a nutritionist role sort of and a therapist role. And, I imagine that the clients that are coming to you knowing that you're going to address their diets with them to some extent. They know that that's your. So I guess my question is, what about the clients who maybe aren't interested, or do you ever have clients who you maybe don't address the nutrition piece with? I've had so many clients, I feel like, who maybe I wanted to say something or address their nutrition, but it almost felt to me like, am I just imposing my own sort of personal beliefs about food or my own approach about food? Because you can have clients who, like with the intuitive eating, people get very upset and very sensitive about that, or people who will have transference stuff with you, let's say, because their parents were really strict with them about food and there were all kinds of issues. So I'm still trying to understand the line, and I want to know if in your own experience, are there ever clients who you feel are not there yet and you wouldn't address the nutrition with, or if they're just not interested? So
Yeah, well, first of all, also let me say that you would no more integrate DBT or CBT or EMDR without training. And I'm not suggesting that you do this without training. That's what I teach. I teach a certification that really gets you started in a 20-hour course. Now, you wouldn't do psychotherapy without training. You have natural skills in it. You have a natural rapport and empathy and a great way about you, but you then learned other specific skills that you built upon. So I'm not suggesting that you go do this without training and understanding. You don't have to go get another degree to do this unless you really get passionate about it, decide to do that. So that's the first thing. And I walk you through that. And then I've got other levels of supervision where I've got courses where I have 12 psychotherapists who come and we meet once a month, and they bring a case and they think through and talk through, how am I going to do this? And what is it that I want to do here? Or what have I found works? So that's really, I think, the first thing to consider, that I'm not expecting you to begin doing this. I want you to begin thinking about it and thinking about what it means in your life and your health, and then what it might mean for your clientele. And if this interests you, that there's an opportunity to move forward with this. Now, just like everything, not everybody is ready for psychotherapy. Not everybody is ready to make changes in their lives. That's part of the art of what we do, is encouraging, cajoling, but also recognizing when someone's ready and when things need to wait. Not everyone's ready to tell their trauma story. So that's our skill as a therapist, is understanding who's ready. But I will say that the students who I've trained in this, many of them decide they want to do this and they want to do it more. And then I work with them and encourage them to really establish a niche. Because let's think of the other side of it. Not everybody wants to talk about their mental health. Maybe they want to talk about their digestion. Maybe they want to talk about their aches and pains. And I always say, we come in through the back door. when we're talking about the physical well-being, about nutrition, can make us feel better. It can reduce our pain, can reduce our depression, it can reduce our insomnia. So think about stigma as well. You know, where I grew up, it was a stigma if you weren't in constant psychotherapy, but we know that not everybody is even ready to do psychotherapy, and this gives us other tools to do it. So you can really use this approach and adapt it, but you do want to train in it and understand the ethics, your scope, your competency, your focus, and begin really at the beginning.
Okay.
Good answer. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Now for the big question or the big answer. Tell us some of the no-nos. What must we stay away from? What must we not eat? Which things can I say to my children? Dr. Korn said you may not eat it. So
Oh,
you may not eat
Moshe,
it.
you're going to use me on this, huh? I see what you're going to do.
Who else?
Well, here's the first adage. If we do things right most of the time, it's not that we can't enjoy a birthday cake at a birthday party. That's not what does us in. It's doing it every day. It's doing it 3 or 4 days a week. You know, stopping off and getting a Big Mac, you know, once or twice a year doesn't do you in, but doing it 3 times a week does. So think about incorporating lots of these healthy behaviors and minimizing these pro-inflammatory foods. The SAD diet, it's the refined foods, it's the packaged foods. Start reading labels. If you can't pronounce it, you shouldn't be eating it. So just begin there. And I also work with this idea that it's often easier to add in healthy foods than it is to get rid of the unhealthy foods. So begin by getting rid of the margarines and the Crisco and the canola oil and start using your pure butter or your pure olive oil, your virgin olive oil or your coconut oil. Start improving the quality, and slowly, just like we do with bad habits, we focus on let's cultivate really good habits and let's allow those bad habits to slowly slink away.
I think education, you know, is one of the things that's really sorely lacking. Maybe it should be somehow incorporated in the school system, you know, school teaching is, except they can't teach that because what would they serve in the cafeteria, right? but but one of the things that's really lacking is a knowledge, basic knowledge of what foods or additives are healthy and unhealthy. So it feels really daunting. I'm just thinking for myself to try to do some kind of lifestyle change, dietetic lifestyle change, when you don't even really know what it is that's good and bad. But you
Well,
know,
I've written the textbook on it. That's a place to start.
let's one
I've
second.
written a
Can we shout
textbook.
it out? What's the name of the book? Let's put it in the chat.
Well, the textbook that I've written for mental health clinicians is called Nutrition Essentials for Mental Health. And I wrote it for us, basically for you, to walk you step by step through answering those questions, Moshe, and to do it without ideology. I think that's the thing too. There's so many fads, there's so many ideology. It's beyond ideology. It's about what's right for the individual. And so I cover those principles and cover how to use motivational interviewing, for example, and integrate that, how to run wonderful psychonutrition groups, how to run a workshop where you're talking about insomnia or depression and movement and sharing feelings and talking about foods and what foods make you feel good and what don't. So that's the textbook. But I've also written a book called The Good Mood Kitchen. It's not a textbook per se, it's really for our patients to answer these questions with lots of recipes. So this information is out there. I'm not the only one, but I've got books on the subject and I've got courses on it as well.
And do you
So
have
you're
book-
not alone. I guess that's what I'm saying. You're not alone.
Is this the book?
Yes, it is. Uh-huh.
This is it, and it's all about avocados, the bottom line. And you know, for a while I was not able to pronounce avocado, which is the reason I didn't eat them, because I knew the adage that if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it. But now it's gone to
I'm in trouble now.
asparagus is another one I can't pronounce right now.
You're doing okay.
Shoots. Okay, so the courses and the books that are, or the courses that you give, are they for lay people or are they specifically for dietitians, nutritionists, mental health professionals?
They're for mental health professionals, and they give CEs for mental health professionals.
Wow.
I know.
Now we're
yeah.
talking.
I know. As
So-
a matter of fact, I'm flying off to Sedona next month for a 5-day retreat to teach 75 mental health professionals all about this.
Okay.
But I've also,
is-
they're mostly online courses though.
and the books, the second book, The Good Mood Kitchen, I'm assuming that's for everybody.
It's for everybody. Yeah.
And does that have lists of foods or recipes, or what is it?
It's recipes, and it's really really answering the kinds of questions that we've been talking about tonight. Really getting rid of the myths that eggs are bad for you, that meat's bad for you, that butter's bad for you, and or that white bread is good for you, because it's not.
That's not a myth either. That's not even a myth. Avocados, are they the number one food like everybody says they are?
I think they're a good food. Yeah, I think they're an excellent food.
Okay. Any other questions from the participants? I saw somebody turned on your videos for a bit. Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about refined sugar? What do you mean when you talk about refined sugar, that's not healthy?
Well, refined sugar is extracted and concentrated so that it really turns into an artificial substance. It becomes drug-like. You heard me talk a little bit earlier about sugar cane. And so I think it's just part of the whole principle of what happens when we extract these active substances from a whole plant and concentrate
You mean how
it.
potent they become? Is that what you're referring to?
Becomes potent. We have an epidemic of diabetes in the world. You saw in the Times on Sunday, the deaths related to diabetes and COVID are highly correlated. It's an absolute disaster. And prior to the introduction of refined sugar in the world, which just happened in 1930, making it available, that is, on a mass level, we didn't have diabetes. So I would say, you've asked what's perhaps the number one culprit. I think white sugar and white flour, you'd go a long way toward improving mental health if you could relinquish those two things.
And what do you substitute them with to feel satisfied or full? Is
It
rice?
depends.
Is rice an option, or?
You mean rice, or I thought we're going to say maybe rice syrup as a sweetener.
No, I was going to say rice.
Sure, whole grain, brown rice, wild rice. There's lots of substitutes. I think you have flours, gluten-free flours, but they're whole foods. You can use honey, maple syrup, molasses, stevia. There's a spectrum. Most people who are coming off, like what you've described, coming off of coffee, you're now doing decaf. Maybe one day you'll go to a light black tea, and then maybe you'll do a green tea. So it's a spectrum where we give up the most potent, powerful drug, and we slowly detox. So maybe it's honey, maple syrup, but then ultimately maybe I'm using very little of those fructose sweeteners, and maybe I'm sweetening with Korn syrup or stevia, xylitol.
What about organic? Because I know there's this argument that that there's a tremendous difference between using organic and not using organic. Is that something you're familiar with? You believe in that?
I try to use organic. Yeah. try to use organic foods, try to reduce the exposure to the pesticides. Yeah.
And when it comes to poultry or meat, and they talk
Mhm.
about using natural versus
Yeah.
grain-fed or grain-fed
Yeah.
versus
Yeah. I think you're talking now
antibiotics.
about refinements. Yeah. I'd rather invest in an animal protein that's antibiotic free. We
Eggs that are,
know that the hormones that they use in these feeds are causing early onset puberty. They're disrupting endocrine function in children. We're seeing gynecomastia, breast growth in boys. So we want to try to reduce these exposures. And I think that's one of the principles where we reduce the exposure to the negative and we enhance the exposure to the positive. And I think what you're identifying is a whole panoply of choices that we have. You know, I think it was Esther who mentioned kombucha. And when I'm working with Joe was who came in with his hot dogs and sauerkraut. I'm not going to talk about kombucha with Joe. I'm not going to talk about soaking his raw almonds. No, he's eating Planters peanut butter. So now I want to move him from Planters with all that excess palm oil and salt. Want to move him into a healthier peanut butter. Then we'll move into an almond butter or fresh almonds themselves. So it's about tapering and being cognizant of what's really going to grab someone's attention and say, I can do this. I want to do this.
Again, I can see this really daunting for a family, you know, where it's a complete lifestyle change. But it sounds like it
It
can also be
is.
very gratifying if you start to see and feel the differences.
Absolutely. But so is family therapy. Family therapy is daunting.
Family therapy is a
Changing
lot easier.
dynamics,
It's a lot easier than
change,
changing a diet.
changing dynamics of bad communication. I don't know. They're both about equal. But you know what I love to do is engage families in the kitchen. Cooking is a ritual. It's a lost art. I travel the country and people aren't cooking anymore. They're not shopping together. Make it a family ritual to buy, prepare, choose recipes together. It can really become a healing ritual and a meditative ritual as well.
Fascinating. Just for our Eastern European Ashkenazic Jewish population who are on tonight, are there any foods that you're familiar with that are particularly healthy or conducive in I don't know how much you grew up with, you know, but there's cholent and there's other foods. Anything that's particularly healthy and we should stick with?
Well, I'll go back to beets, borscht. You can't get a better food than homemade borscht. And if you like to add, whether it's little sour cream or a little yogurt, what a good combination. Beets are the #1 food for your liver and your gallbladder. They're actually very good for depression as well. And so I encourage people to eat beets a few times a week, along with the beet greens. You can use the beet greens in a little saute if you like. Um, I just made a wonderful chicken soup the other day. A couple of days ago, I made bone broth, and then I made a beef stew. Really I love to keep all of the parts of the vegetables that we may not use. I keep it in a Tupperware for a week in the fridge. The end of every week, I'll make a broth out of those vegetables. And then I've got a beef broth or a chicken broth and a vegetable broth. And then I've got a rich source of minerals. And minerals are called the spark plugs of the body. They really accelerate and ignite all kinds of positive reactions. And there's no better source of these minerals than these freshly made broths. And so, yes, pull out your Boobies cookbook and, understand what it was that they were doing in the old country as well as in this country and adapt it. Like many people who migrated, people fell off the edge with lots of, processed foods. That's what really the 40s and 50s brought after the war. It was all about fast foods and processed foods that really came out of the technological changes post-war. And so we saw a period of, let's say, maybe the 50s, early 50s to the early 60s of canned foods and packaged foods. If you're going to use packaged foods, your frozen foods are much better quality than your canned. So I would just follow your intuition, follow your heritage.
Are canned vegetables, are they of value? Let's say canned beets, or does it have to be?
No. You have to be fresh. Mhm.
And why is that? What happens in the
Well,
process?
when you're processing them, you're heating them to a very high temperature, and then you're canning them in tin oftentimes. And you're just going to lose some of the nutrients that you would get by slow baking. When you slow bake a root vegetable, bake it at a lower temperature for longer, it really brings out the natural sugars. And I tell everyone the way to kick a sugar habit then after that first week of Atkins is make sure you've got lots of these root vegetables. They're among the best for you. They're the least expensive. Add a little butter to it or a little coconut oil.
What are some of
olive
the root
oil.
vegetables besides beets and carrot?
Sweet potatoes, carrots, parsnips, kohlrabi, and then you've got your cruciferous vegetables, your broccolis, your cauliflowers, so good. Also, there's a lot of research on the cruciferous being very good for autism spectrum. And we know that our children in particular and adults are very picky about eating. So that you can actually buy nutrients that really mimic the effects of cruciferous vegetables. We're also treating autism spectrum with high doses of cholesterol too, because there's research suggesting that these children's brains are very low cholesterol. And this is also the danger of these cholesterol lowering drugs as well, by the way.
So what results would we see from somebody with autistic spectrum disorder who is now taking higher levels of cholesterol? What will we see different?
Well, you're looking for an overall effect. It's not just that you're using cholesterol, you're using dietary changes, you're getting off gluten and casein. It's all part of a whole program. And I think that's really the point that I make in my courses. I have something that I call the Rainbow Blueprint. It's 17 pieces to think of a healthy pie and 17 pie slices. Each slice addresses a need we have for mental health. It's not just one nutrient. It's not just one herb, or it's not just one intervention. It's all of them together going to synergize that change. And so you would expect to see, and the research shows you do see, a reduction in some of the aggression or the behavioral symptoms that have been identified as being maladaptive.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Okay, any resources that I can type into the chat box before we call it a night, or
Well,
do you have a website or anything else besides
yeah,
those two books?
you can find me at drlesliekorn.com, and I've got lots of free resources and blogs and downloads and recipes. You can see my books there, which are all on Amazon. You can see the link also to my certification programs from there. And I've got 3 certificate programs. One just came out, and it's integrative medicine and nutrition for complex trauma, PTSD. And that's written for mental health therapists, but every kind of health professional is taking it. And there are CEs for that course. I've got one on dementia and diabetes. It's something we didn't talk a lot about tonight,
Well,
but
we
food
forgot,
is very
we forgot to
important.
talk about the dementia.
In dementia and cognitive decline, that's another course if that's of interest. And then I've got my foundational course, which is nutrition and integrative medicine for mental health disorders.
Amazing. Wow. Okay, this was so, I mean, this, gave us so much food for thought, no pun intended.
Absolutely.
But it's really something to think about. And, you know, I think this is going to make a tremendous difference for my own self and my own mental health, so to say, you know, to start playing with some of these ideas and braving, you know, I'm still young enough that I can brave some life changes and they can have long-term
Never too
effects.
late.
And I'd love
Never
to
too
see
late.
that. And then, you know, certainly.
Well, and for those of you that are interested in this, if you've got clients that you want to do this with, get in touch with me. We can collaborate on behalf of your clients. So you can read about what I do on the website. But absolutely, we are continuing to evolve throughout our whole lives. It's never too late to make these changes.
Okay.
Never too late to do psychotherapy, is it?
All right. Well, thank you, Leslie.
Well,
I really,
thank
really
you.
appreciate that you came out all the way from Mexico to be
I
with
did.
us.
Yeah.
What time
I
is it?
wish I was there with you right now. It's 9:30 here.
Oh, you're an hour behind. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. And
I'm
for
gonna
those of
go.
you, who want to stay on just to say hi, I'd love to meet you. I'm going to turn off the recording now. Thanks again. And
Thank you,
please
everybody.
visit Dr. Korn's website and use her resources. And let's see some good things happening because of diet changing. Okay.
Thanks, Moshe.
Good night.
See you
Bye-bye.
soon.